Welcome to the First Gen American podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Toporek, and I'm a first-generation American. My dad was born in Siberia in 1942 and my mom in Turkey in 1943. I used to be ashamed and embarrassed that my family was different. We spoke different languages. We ate different foods. We were working class in an affluent area of Long Island, New York. In my 20s, through my awakening and journey of self-exploration, I realized how appreciative I needed to be given the sacrifice my parents made to give their children better opportunity. I realized that being first-generation American was more of a superpower than something to be ashamed of. Since then, I celebrated my background, harnessed these values into who I am today, embodying all these qualities into everything I do. In each episode, I'll be interviewing first-generation Americans, helping them tell their stories. I hope you enjoy the show. Please subscribe and like the show, and feel free to send comments or even interviewee suggestions. Thanks for listening. Standing outside of the Pacific Symphony headquarters, about to interview John Forsyte. John's the president of the Pacific Symphony. John was born in suburban Chicago, went to University of Illinois, and is now the president of the Pacific Symphony. His parents are Holocaust survivors. I can't wait to hear his story. John, thanks for taking the time to sit with me. It's a pleasure to be here and really hear your story. And, you know, I usually start with hearing your parents' story and where they were born and, you know, what their journey was like to come to this country.
Love to do that. Their story is much more interesting than mine.
Well, it forms who you are, so.
Yeah. Well, and it was very much a part of every household gathering. There were stories of the war in particular. So my father was born, at the end of his life, he actually said, "I've been lying." And I was born in 1920, not 1921, because Bubala, my grandmother, lied about his age so he could avoid conscription. So he was born in 20 and lived to the ripe old age of 98. So we're very blessed to have him for that long. He was born in Warsaw. And so not unlike The Pianist, if you know the film.
Sure.
When the bombing started, September 1, 1939, he was 18. He was 19. But so, in fact, he and my grandfather, his father, went to the Eastern Front as the Polish army was kind of gathering young men to battle the Germans as they were coming in. And even some of the references in that film and other films, it was like this radio announcement, you know, we need able-bodied men. So he ended up...
So he was fighting on the front lines with his father.
Well, that was the plan, but it all fell apart. And he ended up in the Soviet sector because the Soviets were coming from the other side.
Sure.
And that was very fortunate for him. And in fact, his father said, "I'm going back to Warsaw to get your mother and your siblings." And there were 3 siblings, and complicated story, but so he ended up in the Soviet Union, and he ended up in starvation mode. And when you're in starvation mode, he said the first impulse I had was to enroll in university so he could get fed. So that's what he did. He went to Lvov, of all places, which was Poland at the time, and now we know it as Lviv in the Ukraine. And he enrolled in the Polytechnical Institute there and got his engineering degree between 39 and 41.
I can't even believe that was an option for him, though.
Yeah, he was a Polish refugee that was able to enroll because he was in the Soviet sector. Now, there was a lot of anti-Semitism in school, and after 2 years there, and the Germans attacked the Soviet Union, his Russian classmates betrayed his identity.
Really? And so they gave him up?
They gave him up, and he escaped from, I mean, he has these photographs. He was a great photographer, and he was like really into computers. So he did this whole sort of autobiographical story, and he shows us the window he escaped out of from the dormitory, and then he fled.
So the Nazis were literally
they were there
knocking on the door.
Yeah, his classmates barred the door.
My God.
And he escaped through a window, and he fled hundreds of miles to to the Volga River, where he was a Volga boatman with his friend, and he sang on the radio in Russian, and he had a million jobs. But amazingly, he got this engineering education. So he also, ultimately worked on a hydroelectric plant in the Soviet Union, things like you see in Dr. Zhivago, like the big hydroelectric plant.
So after the war, he escapes. He still is in the
It's
Soviet
during the
Union.
war. So
Right.
In 41, he's running, and he's in sort of near the Volga River, and then he gets captured, and he's by Soviet authorities, and he's sent to a slave labor camp in Siberia, Chelyabinsk, which was horrendous conditions. And there's a zinc mine up there. And that zinc mine, he said when he arrived there, he saw that everybody was coming out of the mine had no teeth left. And he just looked around and he said, if I stay here, I'm going to die. And he begged them to not have to do the mine work. He said he's an engineer. So he worked on construction of the expansion of the factory and these retaining walls and things like that.
So what happened to his family? His dad went back to Warsaw.
Well, his two sisters and his parents made their way back into the Soviet Union quickly. The funny story is my grandmother always traveled with her bed. She always had a feather bed with her, and so they'd wake up in the middle of the market and there were chickens. And my grandfather was a sugar merchant, so he sewed sugar into the lining of his, and he could swap sugar for food. And I'll get to the sort of culmination of this chapter, which was that my dad faked an illness, and a Jewish doctor at the zinc mine helped him escape from the hospital. And he fled back to the southern train line that he had been aware of. And through Jewish geography and photographs, people saw his parents and his two sisters.
So he was able to reconnect with them.
And he found them in Uzbekistan. So that's where they spent from 43 to 46.
That is wild.
Yeah. So from 43 to 46, the five of them were together. Now his brother was the oldest.
What people don't appreciate about that is that there's no communication.
None.
There's just word of mouth going town to town trying to figure out where people might be. There's no internet, there's no cell phones, there's just human interaction where you're hoping to get information.
There were so many families that lost each other.
Yeah.
So the fact that they were fortunate enough to find each other really created a special feeling for all of them about those years.
What year was that?
So that was 43 to 46 post-war.
So he's now 26 or 25?
Yeah, he would be in his early 20s when he got to Namangan, which is the name of the city that they were in. It's a fairly large city now. And, it was a Muslim community. And as he talks about, they were very tolerant, let Jews live there. It was really fortunate for them.
Sounds like a lot of luck and, timing
and tenacity and, just
figuring it out.
Crazy experiences. The other sibling, my uncle, his brother, who's the eldest, and his wife, who was a really fine violinist. And that's another story in the puzzle of my life. Unfortunately, they think were liquidated, part of the liquidation of the Lodz ghetto. So they didn't survive the war. And he had immense family. So on both his parents' side, there were many, many siblings and many cousins, and only very small segments of those families survived the war.
What amazes me is that most people ended up going west. Very few went toward the Soviet Union. And, because my father was also in Ukraine and Poland, and they just kept going west.
Yeah.
And this is even after the war, but
it wasn't safe, ironically, to go west. I mean, you could have been in any Western European country and you would have been occupied by the
absolutely.
Nazis. So I think the irony is that the Soviet Union is horrible and unsafe as it was
safer.
safer, especially where they ended up. I mean,
Right.
Uzbekistan was really, and there were a fair number of Polish refugees in Uzbekistan that
Yeah.
were then repatriated in 46. And that's an amazing story, is like the train trip back. And, my dad's sisters, my aunts, would say, your father would always make sure we were comfortable. We were the only freight car that had lighting, because he's built an electric. We were the only one that had a toilet. He cut a hole and then put a toilet and a curtain. And then they told the story, there was a point where they stopped and they run into the field, they go to the bathroom, they grab a potato, because there's no food.
Yeah, there's no food.
And the train leaves and he's left behind. So he catches another train, a coal train. And when they see him, he's completely, he catches up with them and he's completely silent. So
he was separated quite a few times.
Right. Then they get back to Warsaw, and of course, Warsaw is completely destroyed. There's no Jewish population left. So they very quickly made the decision through, I guess, an early Haganah group, this kind of Palestine group, to get them out of Poland. And they fled illegally across the border in a truck. And there's all sorts of stories about that trip. And then they ended up in Salzburg, Austria, in a displaced persons camp that was called Little Palestine, on the edge of Salzburg, if you can imagine, like some really romantic place. And then he became employed by the U.S. Army and built a Jeep out of scrap parts. And, he was a really talented engineer. And it was that Jeep that enabled him years later to pick up my mother, who's with her sister, who's pregnant. She was also in that camp. And I can tell you a little more about her story. But
how long were they in that camp for? Because that's
my dad and his siblings were there from 46 to 51. So there was a good 5 years. Some went to Israel and moved there initially.
Right.
And in the case of my dad, he wanted an American visa, and he ended up getting it.
What made him want an American visa? Because a lot of people did go through Israel, but he already made the leap.
He had some, I think, insight about, number one, he loved American culture. In Poland, he was exposed to Hollywood, and he learned bits and pieces of English from watching American cowboy movies and Charlie Chaplin and Laurel and Hardy. They were like, even late in life, we would watch these things together, and he was just on the floor laughing. And he had a great sense of humor. So I think he just was attracted to American culture. He thought there were jobs. And, that was I don't know that he was thinking we're safe for Jews or not, but he just.
But if you're going to Israel in 1950,
excuse me,
bless you, you're part of building another country. I mean, it's only 2 years old. So it's not like that's an easy.
Well, this was 46.
Right.
So there was no
country.
There wasn't, Palestine was not destined to be Israel in 46. It took Truman and United Nations, all of that. So he did have relatives who moved to Israel, and they're still there. And we have 3 generations of relatives in Israel that are part of the famous cousins, Henyek, Benyek, and Menyek. They were 3 survivors of the war. All Polish, Polish names have
That sounds like the Polish version of the Three Stooges.
Yeah, and they were amazing. 2 of them ended up in the UK and were very successful businessmen, and one ended up in being a colonel in the in the Israeli army and during the War of Independence. So that story culminates there in Salzburg.
And so it sounds like he met your mom in Austria. So let's hear your mom's story.
So she was born in Budapest and came from a wealthy family. Like my dad, both their parents were well off. So he was he made buttons, which was apparently quite a commodity to make the plastic and all that. And it's very successful. He gave money to build a synagogue in Budapest, and she lived a really upper aristocratic life with a beautiful summer home on Lake Balaton, which is gorgeous. And they stayed in Budapest. Of course, the Germans didn't attack Hungary until 44. So Jews had a relatively normal life, 44, and then it was horrible. And she was saved. There were a number of things that happened, but she was saved by a Raoul Wallenborg type person who was not Swedish, but Swiss.
Okay.
I can't remember his name, but it was a Swiss diplomat who created something called the Glass House. And you can look it up on Wikipedia. It was like literally a glass factory where Jews were in Swiss protected housing. So she was there for a while. She was hidden in Christian orphanages. Her mother was kept, sort of put into a forced death march and died. And she didn't hear about it until a bit later.
Did she have siblings, or?
She had 2 sisters who survived, and her dad survived.
Wow.
Her dad went to Israel and lived his life out in Tel Aviv, and her sisters, one moved to Vienna, married a Viennese jewelry, very successful, and her other sister moved ultimately to Dallas, Texas, Texas branch of the Hungarians. I have Hungarians in Australia, and the Viennese branch are no longer, but they're all in the U.S. at this point. So she survived. She stayed in Budapest and finished high school. Never matriculated like she had wanted to, because her dad was ready to leave and move to Israel. And she got on the train and ultimately said, "I want to stay in Austria. I don't want to go with you to Israel."
Really? So how old was she at that point?
She was born in 32, so she was only 17.
Wow, that's a pretty young age to just say, I want to separate from my father and go to a completely different country where I'm guessing she didn't know very many people.
She had her sister.
Oh, her sister was in Vienna. Okay.
Well, her sister was with her in the Salzburg DB.
Oh, got it. Okay.
Yeah, before they made their money, everything was. There's an incredible film, something like Long Journey Home, which a lot of people don't really know this history of displaced persons after World War II. And I think if people knew more about the impact of war and how it doesn't end when it ends, it ends a decade after it.
No, that's very much a common theme is the decade after of where you go and what your journey is and where you end up. I mean, that's the part of the transition, and that's why I'm always curious, what was the journey to get here, because it's always all over the board.
So if they in turn met, in Salzburg and got married in the Mirabel Palace, which was where civil services were held, and it was a very romantic time. They survived. They were young love, but my dad got his visa a year before my mom did. So they married very quickly. She was a lot younger, 11 years younger than he was, and he moved to Chicago and he landed in New York, but he just had a distant cousin who became a very close family friend who said, "You really should come to Chicago. It's much better economically." It's, of course, there's a big Polish community in Chicago. Yeah. I don't know if that was as much an inspiration because the Poles were really bad to my family, and the anti-Semitism in Poland was horrible.
Right.
Like he said, it was almost worse than anywhere else he had been.
Well, that's what drove. So my dad ended up in Poland, and in the 50s, that's what drove them out. Yeah. They had to leave everything behind. Which, when you talk about the decades after war, this is 1955, where they were basically told, you're leaving everything here, and he was on the train and. They took half of his stamp collection and, they just took everything.
Yeah. Well, anti-Semitism, sadly, in Europe definitely did not end with the Holocaust.
No.
It continued. And there were terrible pogroms. So it wasn't safe for Jews to be in Poland. He ultimately, we convinced him to go back in 2001, right on his what we thought was his 80th birthday. And we went to see, the one building that was standing on an entire block that had been completely flat. Even in 2000, it hadn't been rebuilt, was this one building that his father owned. And we also found out that one of his neighbors was the great violinist Henrik Schering, who is one of the 20th century's greatest violin soloists. Wow. And he came to play with the Chicago Symphony in the 80s, and my aunts and my dad went backstage and saw the Schering family, and they were in that apartment building that my grandfather owned. So there's a lot of this, themes that you hear, the assets that were taken.
Yeah.
Obviously, the liquidations of millions of was just, it's kind of mind-blowing when you think about
the magnitude of it is just incredible.
It's hard for people to really understand.
And when you hear story by story of what people have gone through, I actually just interviewed someone who's 39 that left Ukraine when he was 4. And, and everything that we're seeing and living through now, what I think people don't understand is that it's the decades after of the rebuilding. Like my dad literally has 2 monitors on where he's watching the war in Ukraine, where he was, and he was also in the IDF. And so he's just sitting there watching 2 wars of places where, he grew up.
Well, I think, you've sort of inferred some difference that you felt growing up as a first generation, second generation. I don't know what the definition is. I think it was interesting. Ultimately, my parents settled in Chicago. I was born in my first home was Skokie, but we left very quickly. So my older siblings were kind of uprooted, and we moved to a much more upper class community. It's like now the most expensive suburb. And
this is Glencoe.
That's Glencoe.
Yeah.
I was shocked. I was looking at real estate prices there. They're higher than Southern California. It's just gotten crazy.
Yeah, it's crazy.
In the 60s and 70s, when I'm a kid, the classes felt more compressed, but we lived in a very Jewish area. So there were almost no Christmas trees. It was just bubble. Like I lived in a Jewish bubble. I did not understand what a Jewish bubble I lived. And it wasn't just Jews. It was like really well-educated, culturally sophisticated. Everybody was talking about art and books and opera and symphony all the time. And it was I didn't realize that that's unusual. I just didn't know.
I mean, it's very cultured. And so I'm wondering how many of the people that you grew up with actually had parents that survived the Holocaust, because you're not that much older than me. I mean, you're
my age. I don't know anybody.
Right. So it's highly unusual.
Yeah, because my dad was 44 when I was born.
Exactly. Yeah. And so, the rarity of it. I mean, that is, even though you're around Jews, you're different than the other Jews. I mean, you have different. I mean, did they speak different languages at home?
Yeah, I mean, if they didn't want us to know, they spoke German. That was the common language they built. But when my parents met, they actually didn't have a common language. They always tell us that they spoke Latin because that was the common, because my mother was new to German. And the other funny story is that my mother was such a Hungarian snob that she gave my dad a Hungarian history IQ test.
God.
And he's like, I'm Polish. I don't. So, she really, so much of her cultural identity in terms of classical music, art, I think a lot of that was cultivated by being part of that Hungarian society.
Sure.
And so many of the greatest conductors of the 20th century were Hungarian Jews. They were in every major orchestra. There was something else at one time.
So it sounds like, I mean, you were, encapsulated in this cultural music, community.
Yeah.
And it sounds like, the appreciation for it, but where, was that something that was in your household? Did people play music? Was it,
It was just all the time. Yeah. I mean, I had a first cousin who married a professional violinist who was very connected in law. And, I started playing the violin at 7 because Milton Goldberg was teaching on the North Shore of Chicago, and he was one of the biggest disciples of the Suzuki method. Trained in Japan, came here. So there were all these kids my age who were playing the violin, or they were learning other instruments, and then we had interlocking and Michigan. I mean, the scene was like the orchestral and band scene was just incredible. And many of the kids in my high school ended up becoming artists or nonprofit leaders I mean, I went back for my reunion of my 8th grade class, which was way more interesting. And they were all, these Glencoe kids were just doing fantastic things. And I don't know, I feel so lucky that we landed there. It was very, very hard on my brother and sister because Skokie was a much better fit for them. It was much more of a middle class community. They weren't used to the wealth. And there was just, maybe it was this because they grew up more in the 60s, the social upheaval. It was hard for them to go through the north suburbs of Chicago.
What did your parents do that they were able to transition from Skokie to Glencoe?
That's a funny story. My dad interviewed for a job on the day I was born, and the owners of the company called Felpro, it's a very large Jewish-owned company that made, if you ever listen to Car Talk, I don't know if you ever listen to Car Talk on National Public Radio, these two great auto mechanics who went to MIT, but they're auto mechanics. They always say, Car Talk is sponsored by Felpro, maker of fine sealants. Well, they made sealing products and gaskets, and my dad was the chief engineer. Oh. But that job he got the day I was born. And the guy's like, why aren't you at the hospital? He's like, he didn't miss his job.
Feed my child.
He didn't miss his job interview. Anyway, so he had a long 3-decade career. And
at the same company.
Yeah, as an engineer, and became the chief engineer, and grew over time. And it was a very generous company that ultimately got sold to a public company, and they destroyed it, which is another
not surprising.
Another topic. But they were very philanthropic. They gave tons of money to public radio. Again, Jewish owned, and they were a company that air conditioned the factory before anybody else was air conditioning. Built a daycare center, which my brother was brought on as an architect to design the daycare center.
Wow.
And that became a big part of his career. So they just were very,
they were taking
there was an epitonic quality there. They paid your college tuition if you were in state. And the owners, who could have been lived like billionaires, lived much more like we did in that sort of upper middle class area.
But for them, it was about taking care of their employees and just
family. And being a Chicagoan.
Yeah.
And that whole, what does it mean to be a Chicagoan? What does it mean to love your city, be civically engaged? That was something that was installed in my brain when I lived there. I could just see the leadership. It was incredible. So I do think that, when you grow up on the West Coast or in LA, or some cities have it, but it's very different. Like this really tight-knit.
Chicago, and I would say Detroit. I went to University of Michigan.
Yeah.
And I spent a lot of time. I mean, people in Detroit, you just don't
committed.
Bet against
St. Louis, people. Same thing. Yeah. Just Cleveland. They're very committed. They're proud of their city, and they work hard to make it great. And I think the other blessing that I had living in Glencoe was being a half mile from Ravinia. And Ravinia was the summer home of the Chicago Symphony.
I've actually seen the Symphony there. It's incredible. And that venue is spectacular.
Outdoor, beautiful sculpture garden. It wasn't just a concert venue. It was really an art park and an educational institute.
Yeah. So I've been there probably 3 or 4 times, and it's just this community. The only other thing I could equate it to is in Boston, seeing the Boston Symphony.
Tanglewood.
Yeah. And people just take blankets, and the food extravaganza is insane. Everyone outdoing each other. Right. It's this.
I mean, we have our traditions in LA, and Orange County, and the Hollywood Bowl, of course, is an incredible venue. But there's something special that it was embedded in the suburbs.
Yeah.
And it was so convenient. So we rode our bicycles to concerts. So
I mean, I had friends. Really we would just walk, and we would because I worked in Chicago in the summers, so I spent my summers in Chicago, which is arguably the best time to be in Chicago.
Yeah, totally. So it was very magical. And I think all of that, you asked a question about how did I get to where I was, but there were triggering, it was the high school orchestra, it was my mother, it was playing the violin, but then I was pre-med, and, my parents,
pre-med.
typical Jewish parents, were like, we need a doctor.
Right.
I like science. So I went to University of Illinois. I was a biology major and took organic chemistry and all of that. And there was a really first-rate music library at the school. Illinois, surprisingly, it's like the fourth largest library system in the country. So they had these fantastic
There's
places.
a lot of surprises at University of Illinois.
Right.
The first property we ever bought for my company was in Champaign. And that's where the supercomputing center
exactly
started.
Oh, yeah.
Where it's like nobody would know
So
that.
what are the two films? Here's a quiz question. What are the two films that every year they show at the University of Illinois?
Oh, I have no idea.
So the first one is Risky Business. Looks like U of I,
right?
If you remember Tom Cruise's line.
That's right.
And the other one is 2001: Space Odyssey.
Oh, really?
Because HAL
was created.
If you say it says HAL 9000,
yeah,
and underneath it says Urbana, Illinois.
Oh, wow.
I mean, it was Kubrick's imagination, but it speaks to where the technology was. Anyway,
exactly.
The other thing that people may not know about the University of Illinois is it had one of the greatest performing arts centers. It was better than Lincoln Center. It was that good. In fact, the Chicago Symphony recorded all 9 Beethoven symphonies. Their Grammy Award-winning box set of Beethoven symphonies were recorded at the Krannert Center. Every year, there was a pilgrimage by the Chicago Symphony down to Illinois, Champaign, and they sounded 100 times better there than they did in Chicago.
That's wild.
And it just was that performance, my freshman year and my sophomore year, and I was like trying to track where they were staying, and I would like go to the pizzeria.
You know where they did?
Oh, I was stalking them. Totally.
So
and finally they invited me, like a couple of the violinists invited me to sit with them one night. And, they said, what do you want to do? And I said, I actually think I want to go into orchestra management.
That's so specific. You're in college, pre-med, and you're just following your passion. You're just following what you love.
I found a magazine. This was the key. At the music library was a magazine called Symphony Magazine, which was the trade publication for the League of American Orchestras, which is our service organization based at the time in DC, now in New York. And Symphony Magazine was a whole magazine about running orchestras. It was about how do you sell tickets? How do you program concerts? How do you build education programs? What does a board do? It was all of this stuff. And that journey began right there. And the dean of the School of Business at Illinois, I told him, I'm pre-med, but I want to go into orchestra management. In that meeting, he started crying.
Really?
And I said, are you upset with me? He says, no. He says, I've never had a student who wanted to go run a symphony orchestra. And so
that's pretty specific.
Yeah. And he said, I'll help you. He said, I'm a subscriber to the Chicago Symphony and the Lyric Opera. So this is my dream.
Well, you said it to the right person who was going to help you figure out a way.
He was a great, great dean. And he really, so I could take a lot of music classes and a lot of business classes and catch up, and did some summer work and started doing internships. And fast forward to graduation, again, the Jewish parent syndrome. My dad said, you'll never survive as an orchestra manager. There's no money. And he said, why don't you get some business training? So, and the other thing they said, which was a terrible thing to say to a kid who's very impressionable, is they said, you know nothing about business. We're all a bunch of sciences. Everybody in my family was a doctor. All my cousins. And the exception were my siblings. One of whom is a cinematographer, artist, and my brother's an architect. It's
all very creative.
All very creative. But the doctors were the doctors, and they were like, that was the honorable profession, and we were the ones who were going to starve. And
I was supposed to be a lawyer, and
I
knew I was not going to make that happen.
The good thing is that I got a horrible job after college in retail, and I kind of I procrastinated the decision, because you could be a department manager or you could work as an assistant buyer. And I thought, oh, I like to boss people around, so I'll be a department manager. And somebody said to me, who was upper level, terrible decision.
Yeah.
Go be an assistant buyer. You don't even know if you like retail.
So you decided to do that just because that was a job
It was
versus
a job, and I was like trained. My dad saw it as a
training.
pathway to more
Yeah.
security because he was so scared about security.
Yeah, that's a common theme of, getting a paycheck and a healthcare plan. And
But within 8 months, they assigned me, because I progressed, they assigned me to junior girls clothing. And it was total culture shock. Nobody respected me. I was treated horribly. And I just thought, okay, this is good sensitization. And I quit that job very quickly. And I remember the woman who ran that buying shop, she's like, you can end up on the street. She was so embarrassed that I was quitting. You can end up on the street. You don't have another job. And I said, I know this is hard to understand, but my parents live in Glencoe. I'm going to live with them for a while. And I'm going to go to a conference about symphony orchestra management in 3 months. It's in Chicago. She's like, what are you talking about? She's like, I want to go run an orchestra. So the Chicago Symphony was the host orchestra of the national conference 3 months after I quit my job. And that was the most emotional moment of my life. Like, everybody was coming to my city to listen to my orchestra that I thought were the greatest rock stars. And what was incredible is Leonard Bernstein, no less, was conducting. It was the first time he had conducted the Chicago Symphony in over 3 decades. So it was like this unbelievably emotional confluence of he's like my Jewish hero. Nobody's like Bernstein in every respect about Jewish art, Jewish culture, philosophy, everything. Like, the guy was just quintessential what I pride about Jewish people. It's just learned. And he came and did Shostakovich symphonies, which were like the Leningrad War Symphony, his first symphony, and he recorded it. And I took orchestra managers from all over the country. I was giving them tours of the city, and we went for Ethiopian food. And I was like, this is it. I felt it. And then I applied for like 10 jobs. I got 10 job offers.
Wow.
Crazy, like entry level things. Like, I could go record Van Cliburn competition candidates. But the job I ended up loving and wanting was to go work for the Wisconsin Chamber Orchestra in Madison, Wisconsin. Because I'm like,
what a great spot.
I just like, I'm 22. I want to live in a college town, and I get to run.
Madison's amazing. So
I was very young, and then they fired the executive director within about 6 months, and I ended up running the whole thing by myself, which I didn't know anything about anything, completely naive. And then, I marshaled through all of that. And
you say you're naive, but you were reading trade magazines when you were
just curious. That's really what comes
well, if you're curious, that means you're passionate, and then you're going to figure it out.
Yeah.
I mean, passion at the end of the day leads to success. And, when you're put in a situation where you have the opportunity to go run something when you know nothing, that's sort of when you figure
there's
out
a lot of
if you love it.
There's just a lot of good things happen I think I had a good nose for nice people. So I picked jobs where I thought the board people seemed nice and welcoming.
And I think a big part of that is that you saw how well taken care of your father was at his company.
Yeah.
So you knew what it meant to work for not just the paycheck and the money, but if I work for good people, good things are going to happen. And that generally is the way it works.
My parents planted certain seeds, which I think are, good Yiddish words. Like, I always use this word Hamish. That's not a word that a lot of people use, but like, are they comfortable? And are they, they have a certain generous spirit to them. And I'm so much more, I'm really attracted to people like that. Like, they aren't there to prove anything. They're just there to like be good community members, be, good friends. And like, that's like the learning journey that my parents always said, they're really Hamish. Or they would say, those are some familiar faces.
But that's an important thing to teach someone that's young, is that's a key quality that you were taught if you look for this quality consistently, your bubble around you will always be good people. And at the end of the day, that's ultimately what protects you. And that's ultimately what creates success. And that ultimately is what creates joy in whatever it is that you're doing. Because you know pretty quickly when they're not good people. And then if you're stuck, it's pretty painful and pretty uncomfortable.
The other thing that they don't really realize that they taught me, because it wasn't so obvious, was they taught me philanthropy. And they weren't big check writers, but they were big volunteers. My mother volunteered at Hadassah, and my dad would teach at senior centers, and they were personally very generous to their friends. And I think that definitely was a war product of the war. They were extremely generous to their friends in many ways. My dad would go and fix anything at anybody's house who needed it.
Right.
I mean, it's like Alex's bike shop. People would bring their bicycles to our front and he would fix and tune them up. And
well, I think that's part of like the community of people shared trades with each other. Like if you're good at something, like it's almost your obligation to help others do it. If you don't, you sort of get identified as, okay, he's not giving, he's only trying to take from the community. So they tend to get sort of marginalized pretty quickly.
But I would definitely say at the end of the day, with all of those factors that were critical, the right ecosystem, I have to credit, my mother ultimately, because she would take me to the symphony and take me to the art museums. She'd play games with me. She would always whisper the synopsis of the opera in my ear before there were super titles. So she showed a lot of love around the arts. And I think that, it's hard to, obviously I had to be receptive.
Yeah, if you're not interested in it,
And I was a sports nut, I was a Beatles maniac. And so I was obsessed with British rock. But eventually it seeped into my bones. There's this incredibly beautiful thing called symphonic music. And it just overtook me. And that was that. And I'm still a hobbyist. I still listen to it just to identify great conductors, great.
Well, you clearly have an ear for it. And there's a certain, like you see the matrix of the symphony. You can hear things in the whole and you could hear things individually. You can hear individual notes where someone like me, who's pretty much a novice, is just going to enjoy being there and the experience where you're seeing it on a completely different level.
It's just language acquisition. So I always say to people, I never believe anybody when they say they're, they don't have musical talent or their ear isn't good. I'm like, that's just totally made up. It's in your brain. You just haven't exercised it. So, or you've exercised it with different music. And you can hear things on the guitar or you can hear things with the drum solo. It's just learning. And eventually the orchestra's language becomes much more innate after you listen to it for a while. The thing is that this is an art form that's like a novel. So it has huge peaks and big valleys.
Yeah, it's a story.
It's a big story.
And it has emotion, it has feeling, and so much of what has been written in music comes from the pain of war and, love. And it paints this beautiful picture that isn't necessarily visual, that you can, use your imagination of what people were feeling during those moments.
Exactly.
And it's a beautiful art form.
It is.
So tell me, were there any points of adversity where you felt different being first generation American with, different foods and languages and, accents in your household and growing up in Chicago? And
it's funny, I didn't know my parents had an accent until I was 13.
That's a consistent theme.
It took someone to point it out to me.
You can hear someone else's accent, but most people can't hear their own parents' accents.
And then once we figured out our parents had an accent, it was like relentless imitations of them.
We couldn't do that.
Oh no.
Oh no, we could not do that because they were so desperate to try and sound American and fit in.
My parents, we're so lucky to have that. They had such a good sense of humor and they did not take themselves so seriously, so that when we made fun of their unique foibles, they were on the floor laughing, and it was great. I mean, my brother is a brilliant satirist. He can do my mother better than anybody. And she just loved,
I will
she
say
loved the
when the
attention.
grandchildren
Yeah,
start to make fun, I mean,
that's okay then.
that's totally okay. And then they're laughing.
I know. But, my mother had this thing where she said to my kids while she was still alive, "What language am I speaking?" And she would do this and they say, "Is it French?" And she goes, "No, it's Hungarian." And she would do Hungarian and a French
accent. That's cool.
stuff like that. I mean, I think to your question, I felt different, not just because of the European heritage. I felt different because of the intense scientific family I had. Everybody was either the engineer, and the older cousins were all in the sciences. So when we had a Seder, they argued about everything. I mean, it was really 3 hours of intense. So the topics were, the existence of God in the face of scientific evidence to the contrary, this is this, or it was,
Thank God there's 8 glasses of wine to get through.
yeah. I mean, and we had one very religious relative who led the Seder, and he would speed read this thing,
Yep.
and only his
And he wouldn't
sister
he wouldn't hear any of the conflict. His job was to get through it.
No. And I mean, it was mostly a lot of irreverent humor. And I really think that they developed, I mean, because this group had not been captured and sent to a camp, and they had that survival experience, some of which was very painful because they obviously lost a lot of relatives. But their survival journey inspired a lot of laughing, a lot of lighthearted, because that's how they remembered it. And only later in life, when we started to really put the camera in front, when we put the camera on, the stories weren't funny anymore. They were much more painful.
But it sounds like they talked about it.
They talked about it all the time.
Yeah, there's a lot of people that hit it. And actually, one of the first interviews I did, he didn't know his father was actually Jewish and survived the Holocaust until his father passed away. And he found documents in his father's desk. And I mean, that's why I think your parents' story is so interesting, because sounds like you had a wonderful childhood of embracing the fact, because they did feel lucky and fortunate, and they came here and things actually worked out. It wasn't so terrible. And it sounds like your siblings may have had a little bit of.
I think the closer it was to the war. So I have a cousin who was born in 1946, and he was born in that Salzburg refugee camp.
Okay.
So he has some early memories, mostly playful, and he's a poet. So he writes these really beautiful poems about weaving in the meaning of Judaism with his childhood experiences and immigration. And these poems are great and sometimes very sad. I love the fact that Jews think about how to heal the earth. Like that, that is to me what we should be focused on as a people.
I mean, it's a core Jewish value.
It is. And it informs a lot of intellectual thought.
So how have you imparted, your background on your own kids, and the importance of, what you grew up with? What are some of the things that you've been able to pass along to them?
Well, I'm grateful that they were able to meet my parents before they died. That was they have vaguer memories than if they had lived a little longer, but it's impossible to explain what they're like without having experienced them.
Right.
They were really unique. And what was really rewarding to me is when they passed, how many people commented on how important my parents were to them, because their parents were traumatized by the Holocaust. Your dad was like my dad. My cousins were all saying this. And so I think for my kids to sort of see the way as they got older and they were bat mitzvahed, and I think they started to embrace Judaism through the lens of my parents' journey. And they could see it in me, like how emotional I was. So I was very proud of them that they got bat mitzvah. Even though we're not that religious of a family, I think it just meant absolutely.
Yeah, the religion is a separate thing. Culture and the values.
And what they talked about during their, like what they wrote in their speeches, like I thought, okay, it's transmitting down, you know? So my daughter ended up doing this beautiful Anne Frank exhibit at our high school last year and had all these docents trained. And there's still like kids, you know, and my other daughter ran for class president and somebody carved a swastika in her friend's head. It was a pic. So like, they're like processing all of this. Like, how can I do this? And this ends up being like that. And they're smart enough to like realize, and I keep saying to them, the thing you have to understand is a lot of this is like ignorance about what they're doing. What does that symbol even mean? Where did it come from? What does it mean to you? I said, you are a teenager. You can understand other teenagers who are. So our goal is to heal the world, you know, and don't spawn more hatred. It's not like get back at people.
Yeah, it's important to make them understand. I mean, our kids have had some anti-Semitic incidents here, not just with kids, but actually with adults. And it becomes very strange when a 13-year-old kid is actually educating an adult on what it is that they did or said.
Yeah.
And it's because of ignorance, and you can't fault them for that. You just have to educate them.
Well, I'll tell you something that came out of this for me, and I think for my kids, was that they saw how outstanding the administration is at this high school, Los Alamitos High School. Like the principal, the vice principals, the teachers.
We had the same experience.
They were so all in on the Anne Frank exhibit. They were so flattering of my daughter. It was really an incredible experience. So, I mean, everybody's different. My kids are maturing. I don't know how it's all going to impact them over time.
The seeds are there, just like the seeds were with your parents imparting them to you.
So I do think the thing that we haven't talked about, but I would just emphasize, is that there is a Jewish aspect of classical music. And it is something I think a lot about, which has informed my choices. And I think there were artists that were very Jewish that inspired me, like Itzhak Perlman, because Perlman came to Ravinia as a kid. Zuckerman came to Ravinia and Schering and all of these great conductors. And so I was very proud of that. I was like, they're my baseball team, you know, they're so good. But my mother also taught me to appreciate, like, she tried to pull me out of just thinking that way. So, for example, she would take me to see the great sopranos, Leontine Price and Josie Norman, these great African-American superstars. One time my mother said to me, I'm going to take you to go see the Queen. And I knew that Queen Elizabeth had come to Chicago and stayed at the Drake Hotel. And I said, what do you mean we're going to see the Queen? And she said, it's going to be very special. Don't worry. So we go to Ravinia and I'm thinking, Queen Elizabeth is going to come out, and I'm little. So the door opens and out comes this beautiful woman with a white turban and a white dress. And it's Leontine Price, the great soprano. And she said, now just listen to what's about to come out of her mouth.
Wow.
And the audience, I mean, it really is like a religious service.
I mean, if you're into it,
10,000 people were there to hear Leontine Price sing. That I was just lucky enough to be born in 65. I got the last chapter of the age when classical music was totally like a popular art form. And it's because, you know, Ed Sullivan, Johnny Carson, they had classical art. It was very much embedded in pop culture. Bugs Bunny and Stokowski. And so it was really awesome. Now I think the biggest challenge is that as a Jewish person trying to advance classical music, it seems like it's really foreign. It seems very foreign to people. And I go to events and people my own age who are younger, they have absolutely no knowledge at all of what, like no experience with orchestras, no experience. It's just not part of what they do.
Right.
And that's like a big shock to me. And I've been gradually getting used to it, but I realized there's a huge generational change in people's knowledge, emotional connection to it. And I do think that that is a product of being a first generation American. Like, that is how I'm different.
Yeah.
I just was lucky that in Glencoe and Highland Park, there was just a lot of kids like me that were
I mean,
American.
that's highly unusual. And especially to be in that environment and actually embrace it. And,
It didn't feel unusual then.
Right.
And I really hope that there's a renaissance. I think our vision statement, the Pacific Symphony, is we want to lead a renaissance in appreciation and impact of this art form.
I mean, you've been, here for a long time. It's over 26 years.
Yeah.
And, so you've seen so many different transitions.
Do you know it's an amazing irony that really hit me Saturday night? Saturday night, we did a celebration of Nowruz, which is, celebrated by 25 countries, but it's a Persian Iranian tradition. So we have, sold out house, all Iranians, Jewish Iranians, Muslim, Zoroastrian, like the diversity of Iran, all celebrating their arrival of spring. And then we had a project, a mariachi Garibaldi project for our family concerts. And I will make the generalization that people who are new immigrants or maybe first generation immigrants, they really love instrumental music.
Yeah.
They really are attached to it. Now, maybe they don't know the orchestra, but the sound of an orchestra is generally very exciting to them.
Right.
And I think that's different with assimilated Americans who have gotten used to electrified, amplified. So maybe the paradox for me as a first generation is like, it's the people who are coming to our concerts and getting more and more excited are generally of immigrant descent, immediate descent.
Yeah, I mean, that sort of makes sense because in their countries, like, electricity is not necessarily, so easily available, and acoustic instruments are much easier, form to play. There's something soulful in that music, especially in those countries that, like after October 7th, I don't know if you saw the video of the concert in the amphitheater that they did of the song. I mean, that I played that over and over and over again. It's just like that deep feeling of emotion from hearing all those different instruments that are not amplified coming together, and that sort of unity.
Yeah, that's extraordinary.
It's extraordinary. What helps people heal?
The only thing I would disagree with in your comment was that I think the acoustic instruments it's not about not having electricity or they're not easy to play. I think it's just more it's a folk thing. Like,
Right.
There's a great interview from the 1960s. I was just rewatching it with one of the great American composers, Morton Gould, very famous 60s, 70s, interviewing Leopold Stokowski, the conductor that was featured in Disney's Fantasia as a silhouette. Very famous conductor who was champion of all this new music. And Stokowski was talking about what is it that makes music national? And it's folk music. It's the art. And I think folk music can be poetry, it can be instrument, but it's often acoustic music. It's rarely, because it's old. And that's what we have in most symphonic music, is the influence of the country that it was written in, especially after 1820. Before 1820, classical music, as it was known, was very homogenous. It was hard to detect the national origin of things written in Mozart's time.
Right.
Like you could hear, Arriaga, who was a contemporary, in the classical era, and you wouldn't know it was Spanish. Whereas the minute you get into the 1830s, 40s, 50s, you really start to hear, this is French, this is Spanish, it's really interesting. And that's what the Persian traditions are of singing and instrumentation. And it's all that Silk Road music. It's, comes from China. So I think I'm hopeful that as our county is diverse and we can engage all these different communities, that we'll see.
It sounds like if you can do that, then that's how you get the other generations interested, and
I think so.
They take their kids, because it is a cultural thing.
I hope so.
So we have a couple more minutes, and I typically try and do the same rapid fire questions in the end.
Okay.
And we can make it pretty quick. So a book that profoundly impacted your life that you think everyone should read.
Well, there are a few. I love the book Galina, Galina, which is the autobiography of Galina Vishnayevskaya. And it's a woman who became the greatest opera singer of her generation in the Soviet Union, and what it was like to be that famous in a totally oppressive time during Stalin.
Sounds like an amazing story.
She's an incredible writer. So that would be certainly one. And I think Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning, is just peerless.
What's your favorite dish from growing up from your parents' culture?
Well, for my mother made this Hungarian casserole with sausage, hard-boiled eggs, and potatoes, all like in a casserole. It was so good. And kugel with yellow raisins.
Yellow raisins.
Yeah, that was like the special cinnamon.
One tradition or experience from either one of your parents' heritage that you kept alive with your family.
Seders. I love a good Seder, although I try to add humor.
Well, it's coming up.
Yeah.
We're actually going to do it. We're going to be in Italy, and we're going to do a Seder in Italy. It should be fun. And then finally, one piece of advice that you got from your parents that stuck with you that you want to pass along.
I really think, yes, it's important to save and have resources, but ultimately you are defined by your family, and really prioritizing family over everything else. And it's a hard thing to do in American society, but it's more than just spending time with your kids. It's like trying to transmit a set of values and guide them to withstand the pressures they have to be unethical or to be, dishonest, like just be honest, be ethical, take care of people around you, those kinds of values.
What I find interesting is that the way you can detect that is how other people talk to you about your own kids. And, I just recently heard some of this, and it's astounding when you hear it, because you're just like, wow, like all that hard work, just that little kernel of a seed that you planted that you saw translate in how it may have helped somebody else.
Yeah.
You're just like, wow, like it's working. Like he's actually going to be like a good human that helps other people. It's the most rewarding, yet like
it is not always compatible that you can make a great living and be a total match.
Yeah.
It is not always the case.
Right.
And sometimes you have to step away and figure out how to sacrifice something, maybe financial, because invariably, there are very, very honest business people, and they make their money in the most honest and high integrity. And then there are people who have made money in ways that have not helped society, and that's a tricky thing that I've tried to instill in a conversation, which is you can make a good living, but find something you're really passionate about, and make sure that when you go to bed at night, you feel like you're really doing right by your city, your community, your neighbors, whatever it is, you're making a contribution. That's, to me, the ultimate lesson of, where you end up at the end of this journey. Like, are you going to look back and say, I think I made a valuable contribution?
Yeah, it's the contribution of, what impact it just to live a life where you've been able to enjoy the things that are here is not enough. What did you leave behind that's meaningful, that is going to survive you and impacted other people? That's very hard.
I'll tell you, one of the blessings of running the Pacific Symphony is I have been surrounded by the elite community people. Truly, the symphony has attracted board members staff, musicians.
But that doesn't happen by accident.
Yeah.
It happened. You've been here for a long time.
It's the art farm. I think the art farm attracts great people.
Oh,
That's my theory.
I'll disagree with your theory. And I think for someone who, has knowingly surrounded themselves to work around good people tends to attract good people internally and in the community to be a part of something that, clearly your mission is bigger than just playing good music. It's, bringing community together and passing along the beauty of the art form so that it carries through the generations. And, it's shocking to me that, it's incredibly rare for anyone to hold any position for 5 years, let alone 25, 26 and counting. So
I'm a lucky guy.
Yeah, you don't have a job. That's one of the great things in life is if you're passionate about what you do every day, and you wake up every morning, it doesn't feel like a job, then, you're winning.
Good way to end it.
Well, John, thank you so much. Appreciate it. This was great.
Really good to talk to you.
Thanks for listening to the First Gen American podcast. I hope you enjoyed the show. Feel free to leave your comment and make sure to smash the subscribe button.